John Miller never expected his quiet life in Cedar Hollow to be shattered by the discovery of a secret buried beneath an old oak tree, a secret that revealed decades of hidden injustice. Daniel Cooper, driven by anger and the weight of his grandfather's hidden past, fought fiercely to keep the truth buried, no matter the cost. But John and Sheriff Reynolds, guided by Rex's relentless instinct, uncovered the truth that changed everything. Just wait until you hear how this tense struggle ended and why justice finally found its way through the shadows. John Miller was a quiet man, the kind of man who lived in the rhythm of seasons, who measured life in slow breaths of wind and the shifting light across fields. A retired Army veteran, he had returned from Afghanistan carrying more memories than he could ever speak aloud. Cedar Hollow was his sanctuary, a small farmhouse on the edge of town surrounded by open fields and towering trees. Here he had found peace, or at least he thought he had. His only companion was Rex, a loyal German shepherd who had been with him through years of training, tours, and silence. Rex wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a guardian, and a friend who seemed to understand the unspoken language of John's life. That morning, though, something felt different. The air was heavy with a strange stillness, as if the world itself were holding its breath. John stepped out onto his porch with his mug of coffee, watching the mist curl over the meadow. Rex rose immediately, ears pricking sharply. Then, without warning, the dog bolted across the yard. John froze. "Rex?" he called softly, but the dog did not come. Instead, Rex moved with purpose toward the edge of the property, stopping abruptly beside an old oak tree. His body stiffened. A low, cautious growl rumbled in his throat. John frowned. This wasn't normal. Rex was trained to respond to commands, but now he was unshakable, fixated on something at the base of the tree. John walked over slowly, trying to keep calm. "Come on, boy," he murmured, crouching down and extending a hand. He offered treats, calling Rex's name gently, but the dog only barked louder, his growl deepening. His eyes glistened with intensity, fixed on something hidden beneath the roots. John's curiosity turned to unease. This was no ordinary dog instinct. His military training told him to pay attention when something was wrong, and Rex was signaling exactly that. He knelt beside the oak and studied the base of the trunk. There, hidden under layers of moss and earth, was something strange. A hollow covered by a burl of rotting wood. It didn't look natural. The edges were jagged, and the hollow seemed too deliberate to be caused by decay alone. A chill ran down John's spine. His mind raced. Could it be an animal's den? A remnant from some old accident? Or something else entirely? He reached out to touch it, the bark cool under his fingers, when Rex barked sharply again, almost as if warning him not to. By midday, John had called Sheriff Mark Reynolds. Reynolds was a tall man, with years of experience and a quiet steadiness that came from decades on the force. When he arrived, the sheriff stepped out of his patrol truck with a serious expression. He glanced at the oak tree and nodded toward Rex, who was still sitting rigidly, eyes locked on the hollow. "You think it's something dangerous?" John asked quietly, his voice low, almost reluctant to disturb the tension. Sheriff Reynolds didn't answer right away. He approached slowly, scanning the tree and its surroundings. "Could be anything," he said finally, his tone steady but guarded. "Let's see what we're dealing with." They worked together, moving with careful precision. John found a sturdy branch, and the sheriff brought gloves and tools from his truck. The burl resisted at first, crumbling reluctantly under their hands. Then, as they pried away the final fragments of decayed wood, a glint caught John's eye. Sharp, metallic, and unnatural. They exchanged a glance. Beneath the hollow lay something unexpected. A small box, old and locked, the iron clasp rusted shut. It looked as though it had been hidden for decades. The sight made John's palms sweat. He reached forward, but his hands trembled, uncertain whether to touch it. Rex's growl rose again, louder this time, more urgent. The dog pressed closer to John, his body tense. Sheriff Reynolds stepped forward, frowning deeply. "This isn't ordinary," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the box. "Whatever's in there, it's worth being careful about." The air between them seemed heavier now, charged with a sense of mystery and warning. The oak tree stood silent, guarding its secret. Somewhere deep in John's gut, he knew this was the beginning of something far bigger than a strange discovery. The air grew heavier as Sheriff Reynolds rested his gloved hands on the small iron box. The burl's removal had left the hollow exposed, and now the strange weight of discovery pressed down on the clearing. John Miller stepped back slightly, his boots crunching softly against the fallen leaves. Rex remained alert, growling low, his eyes never leaving the tree. The sheriff placed the box carefully on the ground. It was small, but solid, its surface pitted with rust and age, like a relic that had survived decades buried in silence. Reynolds glanced at John, and then at Rex, before kneeling. "Careful," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Whatever's in here has been hidden for a reason." John nodded, though his curiosity burned hotter than caution. Together, they worked to pry the box open. The lock gave with a creak that sounded almost like a sigh, and the lid shifted under the strain of rust and age. Inside lay a collection of items that none of them had expected. The sheriff pulled out the first layer, stacks of faded papers, brittle with age, their edges curled and yellowed. Beneath them, photographs lay carefully arranged. A small leather pouch sat tucked between the papers, containing coins that shimmered strangely in the afternoon light. Old, worn, and stamped with markings neither man recognized at first glance. But it was the object resting on top that drew every breath from John's lungs. A folded leather journal, worn but intact, as though the years had preserved it by will alone. The cover was cracked, the edges frayed, and the leather softened with time. John reached toward it almost reverently, but Reynolds lifted it first, his fingers steady despite the weight of what they might find. The sheriff opened the journal carefully. On the first page was a name, Samuel Cooper. Below it, the writing was precise, deliberate, entries filled with dates, cryptic notes, and sketches. What froze John in place was a drawing of their very surroundings, a hand-drawn map of Cedar Hollow, with careful lines marking trees, streams, and clearings. At the center of the map, a bold X was drawn, directly where the oak tree now stood. John's breath caught. He leaned closer, scanning the fragile pages. One line made his skin crawl. "The tree marks the place where the truth sleeps. Guard it with your life." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, heavy with meaning. John looked up at the sheriff, who was frowning deeply. The photos beneath the journal showed a young man in a military uniform, standing in a place that seemed familiar, holding a worn map in his hands. There was a seriousness in the man's eyes that seemed to reach across decades. Sheriff Reynolds adjusted his grip on the journal. "This isn't just an old keepsake," he murmured, almost to himself. "This could be something serious, maybe tied to a decades-old case. His eyes scanned the photographs again, lingering on the map. Look at this. This location hasn't been on any record I've seen. John felt the air grow heavier. A strange sense of weight pressed on his shoulders, a quiet certainty that this moment was far bigger than a forgotten box. "Why here?" he asked softly, almost under his breath. "Why now?" Rex pressed against his leg, whining softly, as if urging him to understand something John could not yet name. His loyalty was no longer just instinct. It was something deeper, a warning etched in the bond between them. The sheriff stood abruptly, brushing dirt from his knees. "We need to secure this," Reynolds said firmly. His voice carried authority, but also an unease John could not ignore. "Whatever's in that journal, whatever that box hides, it could change everything we know about this place." John opened his mouth to respond, but before the words came, movement at the edge of the clearing caught their attention. A pickup truck rolled slowly down the road, its tires crunching over gravel. The engine cut, and a man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a worn leather jacket, his posture rigid. His eyes locked instantly on John, the oak tree, and the box lying between them. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that made John shift his stance. The man's voice was low but steady, almost too calm. "That box belongs to me," he said. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than any object they had uncovered. John and Reynolds exchanged a sharp look. Rex's growl deepened, his stance unchanging, his warning unmistakable. The silence that followed was thick with questions no one was ready to answer. The stranger's boots crunched across the gravel as he stepped closer to the clearing. His leather jacket creaked softly, and the air seemed to tighten around him. Sheriff Reynolds straightened, his hand resting on his belt, the weight of authority settling in. The man stopped a few feet from them, his eyes, dark and sharp, locked on the oak tree and then on the small iron box. "My name's Daniel Cooper," he said at last, his voice carrying a tone that was calm but edged with steel. "Samuel Cooper was my grandfather." There was a moment of silence. Then Daniel's voice sharpened, carrying something heavier, resentment. "That box isn't just old papers and coins. It contains family secrets, secrets that could destroy lives if they're ever revealed." "And I want it gone." John stepped forward slightly. "That box isn't yours to take. We don't know what's in it. It could be important." Daniel's expression hardened. "I don't care about your laws. My grandfather died protecting this." His voice dropped, trembling slightly with something unspoken. "That tree hides something no one should know." Sheriff Reynolds stepped between them, placing a steadying hand on John's shoulder. "Daniel, this is a potential crime scene. We can't just let you take evidence. The law's clear." Daniel's jaw tightened, and his eyes glistened with something John couldn't place, a mix of fear and rage. "You think I care about your laws?" he said coldly. "I care about my family. My grandfather swore this would never be touched. He trusted me to protect it. That box isn't a relic. It's a burden. And you're trespassing into something that doesn't belong to you." John felt a surge of frustration tighten in his chest. "This isn't your choice alone," he said firmly, stepping forward. His voice rose slightly, carrying conviction. "Whatever's inside could affect everyone, not just your family. Rex found it for a reason. We need to know what's going on." Daniel's nostrils flared. His posture stiffened, and the air between them seemed to grow hotter. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice breaking into anger. "You can't just dig up the past." His words struck the clearing like a blade. The sheriff moved to put himself between them, his voice low but firm. "Enough, Daniel." Calm down, but the tension was palpable. Rex barked furiously, circling the oak tree, his low growls vibrating through the stillness of the afternoon. Then Daniel's hand shot forward toward the box. He moved with sudden force, his fingers closing over the iron lid. John reacted instantly, grabbing Daniel's arm. "Stop!" he barked, but Daniel shoved him back with surprising strength, sending John stumbling several steps away. The movement was sharp enough to topple some of the brittle papers from the box. They fluttered to the ground in a quiet cascade. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, voice tense. "Daniel, back off!" But John and Daniel were locked in their struggle when something small clinked against the ground. A metal object slid free from between the scattered papers. John bent down, his breath catching in his throat. Sheriff Reynolds stepped closer, peering at the object. It was a small metal key, dark with age, its surface engraved with intricate, unfamiliar markings, the kind of markings that seemed deliberately hidden from casual view. The sheriff's face grew serious, his voice dropped, almost in a whisper. "That's not just a key. It looks like a safe key." John's breath caught. He looked up at the oak tree, then at Daniel. What does that mean?" Daniel's face hardened further, his expression unreadable. "It means," he said slowly, almost reverently, "that everything buried here is far more dangerous than you think." A heavy silence fell. The wind rustled through the oak's leaves above them, and even Rex went still, his growl fading into a tense, watchful quiet. All eyes turned to the tree. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions and the sharp certainty that whatever lay hidden beneath the oak was about to change everything. And for the first time, no one moved. The air in the clearing still carried the tension from moments before. Sheriff Reynolds pulled out his radio and spoke quietly into it. Within minutes, the low hum of engines and the crunch of boots on gravel announced backup. A small team of deputies arrived, their presence lending an unspoken sense of order to the chaos that had gathered around the oak tree. John stepped aside as the sheriff addressed the team, explaining the situation. Daniel Cooper stood apart, silent now, his arms crossed tightly, his expression unreadable. Rex remained by John's side, eyes fixed on the base of the tree, as if guarding the secret it held. With the sheriff's guidance, they began to follow the journal's instructions. The worn leather pages had contained more than faded words. They held a map, markings, and clues pointing to something hidden deeper. At the base of the oak, they discovered the compartment Samuel Cooper had carefully concealed. John knelt by the tree, brushing away decades of dirt and moss. His fingers traced the key's intricate markings before sliding it into a rusted lock. There was a sharp click, and with a careful pull, the hidden panel gave way. Beneath it lay a small iron chest, darkened with age, sealed by time itself. The sheriff lifted it with steady hands. When the chest opened, a hush fell over the clearing. Inside were military medals, worn but shining with a quiet dignity. Folded letters, brittle with age, were stacked neatly alongside official documents. Reports that told a story Samuel Cooper had buried long ago. John unfolded one of the letters carefully. Its words were clear, though faded. "I hide this truth not out of shame, but to shield those who cannot speak for themselves. Let history remember, but not destroy them. The documents revealed something staggering. Samuel Cooper had been part of a cover-up during the war, not out of cowardice or greed, but to protect soldiers wrongly accused of war crimes. His act of concealment had been both a burden and a sacrifice, a mission he had carried in silence until his death. The weight of that truth fell across the clearing. Daniel stepped forward, his voice low, trembling. My grandfather, he wasn't hiding shame. He was protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. His hands shook as he folded his arms against his chest. A tear slid quietly down his cheek. He sacrificed everything to keep them safe. John placed a steady hand on Daniel's shoulder. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on the front lines, he said softly. They're fought in silence, in shadows. Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the chest. Sheriff Reynolds watched them both with quiet satisfaction. This was bigger than any of us imagined, he said. You and Rex brought it to light. John looked toward the oak tree, now still and solemn. He ran a hand along Rex's fur, feeling the quiet hum of peace settle over the clearing. Some things aren't meant to be forgotten, John said, his voice thoughtful. But some truths, they have to be found. The deputies gathered the items carefully, placing them in evidence bags, their movements respectful and deliberate. There was no sense of urgency now, only a deep understanding that something precious had been uncovered. Rex lay beside John, tail wagging gently, his alertness giving way to calm. The dog's growls and restlessness had vanished, replaced by a quiet sense of satisfaction. It was as though Rex knew the truth had been found, and justice, however delayed, had been served. The oak tree stood silent, its rough bark glistening in the afternoon light. For years it had guarded its secret. Now it seemed content to stand watch in peace. Cedar Hollow, too, began to breathe differently. News of the discovery spread quietly through the town, carrying with it an unspoken healing. The truth had been uncovered. Old wounds could finally begin to close. John and Daniel remained at the tree long after the deputies had gone, each lost in thought. There was no need for more words. They had found what they were searching for in different ways. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the clearing. Above, the oak's leaves whispered softly in the wind, as though offering a final benediction for the truth it had kept for so long. And the forest and the town began to heal.